On February 15, 1985, the morning after Valentine's Day, at 9:14 a.m., a maintenance worker pushed open the sliding glass door of a small Arlington, Texas apartment. The door wasn't locked. The air inside was warm, still, heavy with the faint scent of vanilla. On the counter sat a heart-shaped cake pan, batter half mixed, a wooden spoon resting in the bowl, as if someone had stepped away for just a moment. But in the bedroom, 22-year-old Rachel Monroe lay sprawled across the floor. Her face was bruised, her clothes torn, her body bloodied from a savage beating. She had been baking a cake for her fiancé. Now she would never see him again. The engagement ring, $5,000 worth of promise for a future she would never have, was gone, stolen from her hand. No weapon, no forced entry, no signs of a struggle beyond her body itself. Just an unfinished Valentine's surprise interrupted by horror. Detectives would later call it one of the most brutal crimes they'd seen. And yet, it was the silence of that kitchen, the cake abandoned, the door left unlocked, that haunted them most. If you believe Rachel deserved justice long before it came, hit subscribe so her story and the stories of others like her are never forgotten. What no one knew then was that the killer wasn't some faceless drifter. He was closer than anyone imagined. A neighbor who had already slipped through police hands and who would commit more murders before his name was finally revealed. Nearly 40 years later, Valentine's Day, 1985, Arlington, Texas. The apartment smelled faintly of cocoa powder and vanilla extract. Rachel Monroe stood at the small galley-style counter, sleeves rolled up, her engagement ring glinting under the kitchen light as she poured sugar into a bowl. Her fiancé, David Larkin, was away on business in Houston, but Rachel had planned a surprise for his return. A heart-shaped cake, frosted red, waiting for him when he walked through the door. It was their first Valentine since he proposed. Rachel wasn't the kind of woman who usually fussed over grand gestures. Friends knew her as practical, the one who balanced her class schedule with part-time shifts at a local pharmacy, the one who'd already mapped out a career in nursing. But this day meant something different. She wanted David to feel how certain she was about the life they were building. On the kitchen table sat recipe cards, a handwritten grocery list, and the engagement ring box she kept near her when she baked, almost as if it reminded her of the future she was planning. At 7:45 p.m., a neighbor walking her dog noticed Rachel humming softly as she carried in a bag of groceries. Nothing seemed unusual. By 8:30, the mixing bowls were out, measuring spoons laid neatly in a line. Rachel cracked eggs, sifted flour, and wiped a streak of chocolate across her cheek without noticing. On the countertop, she had propped up a Polaroid of herself and David at Christmas, both smiling in front of her parents' tree in Little Rock. The apartment was quiet, the television off, radio low, tuned to a soft FM station that bled love songs into the background. Rachel was alone, but she didn't feel lonely. She felt purposeful. What Rachel didn't know was that she wasn't entirely alone. Behind the building, a man stood near the sliding glass doors of her ground-floor apartment. His name was Howard Denton. He lived less than 2 blocks away, carried the label of registered sex offender, and had been on the radar of Arlington police before. He had seen Rachel around the complex, a young woman with plans, a fiancé, a future. Denton resented women like her, women who had the kind of stability he'd never know. And on that night, with the sliding glass door unlatched to let in a breeze, he found his opening. At 9:11 p.m., Rachel pulled the heart-shaped pan from the cupboard, greasing it carefully. She was still in her nursing scrubs from an earlier shift, hair tied back loosely. A small gold cross rested against her collarbone. She reached for the bowl, stirred the batter, and set it aside to rest. She didn't notice the faint scrape of the glass door behind her, didn't hear the soft rush of air as it slid open. Her hands were busy, her mind elsewhere, thinking about David's face when he saw the cake, about calling her mother later to tell her the recipe had worked. The shadow moved inside. The first blow landed before Rachel even turned around. A sharp strike to the side of her head sent her stumbling against the counter, the bowl crashing to the floor, batter splattering across the linoleum. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled by a hand pressing hard against her mouth. She clawed at Denton's arm, the engagement ring catching the light as she fought back, scratching him across the cheek. He hit her again, harder. The cake pan clattered onto the counter, tilted against the sink. The radio kept playing an airy ballad, a love song Rachel never heard. Denton forced her into the bedroom. The attack was brutal, deliberate, leaving her bloodied and broken on the floor. He tore the engagement ring from her finger, pocketed it, and stepped back into the night through the same sliding door he had entered. By 10:11 p.m., silence filled the apartment again. The bowl of batter remained on the floor, the spoon bent at an odd angle. The cake pan sat half-filled, the oven never turned on. Rachel Monroe's Valentine surprise was frozen in time. No one came for her that night. Her fiancé would not return until days later. Her body would be found the next morning, lifeless, the apartment still echoing with the traces of what should have been a celebration of love. Morning came quietly over Arlington. February 15th, at 9:14 a.m., maintenance worker Ray Hopkins approached apartment 1B to check a reported leak from the upstairs unit. He knocked once, twice. No answer. The blinds were half-drawn, a shadow of dishes on the counter visible through the window. When he tried the sliding glass door, it slid open easily. Inside, the first thing he noticed was the cake pan on the counter, tilted, half-filled with batter. A wooden spoon lay bent on the floor beside a broken mixing bowl. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and something metallic, heavy. He called out, "Hello? Maintenance?" But silence answered. In the bedroom, he found her. Rachel Monroe lay motionless, sprawled near the dresser, her face swollen from blows, her hands clenched tight. The gold cross still rested against her collarbone, but the engagement ring was gone. Hopkins staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He fumbled for the phone on the nightstand and dialed the front office. Within minutes, police sirens pierced the quiet of the complex. Detective Ellen Carter arrived with the first responders. She had been with Arlington PD for 10 years, but nothing prepared her for this. The crime scene told two stories at once. In the kitchen, a young woman preparing a Valentine surprise, careful, domestic, hopeful. In the bedroom, brutality, rage, theft, and silence. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints beyond Rachel's and her fiancé's. The sliding glass door was intact, undamaged, simply left unlocked. Carter crouched near the counter, eyeing the cake pan. The half-mixed batter, the spoon frozen in place, made her stomach twist. A celebration interrupted in mid-sentence. News spread quickly. At the University of Texas at Arlington, professors dismissed classes, stunned by the loss of a promising nursing student. Friends described Rachel as kind, steady, always helping others. Her fiancé David drove back from Houston in a fog of disbelief, collapsing when he saw the crime scene tape strung across his apartment door. He told police Rachel had planned a Valentine's dinner. He'd even joked over the phone the night before that she'd probably burn the cake. He never imagined it would be the last time he'd hear her voice. Detective Carter's early notes captured the contradictions. Unlocked door, no forced entry, engagement ring stolen. Motive? Symbol? Both. Heart-shaped cake, unfinished. A silent clock stopped forever at the moment of intrusion. Carter knew this wasn't random. Someone had targeted Rachel, timed it when she was alone, when her fiancé was gone. The maintenance worker who found her said it best, voice shaking in his statement. It was like she was in the middle of life, and someone just cut it short. That morning marked the beginning of one of Arlington's most haunting investigations. What no one could see then was how close the killer already was, living just blocks away, hiding in plain sight. And within 9 months he would kill again. The news of Rachel Monroe's murder spread faster than the crime scene tape could come down. By the evening of February 15th, 1985, Arlington was buzzing with rumor and fear. A young woman, engaged, beaten and killed in her own apartment on Valentine's Day. It was the kind of story that clung to people's imaginations, refusing to let go. Detective Ellen Carter sat in the briefing room, legal pad open, as the first round of interviews rolled in. Every line of her notes underscored the same thing. Rachel Monroe had no enemies. She was 22, a nursing student, a part-time pharmacy assistant, described by professors as ambitious, by friends as loyal, by her fiancé as the kind of person you can build a life around. Nothing about her life suggested she was marked for violence. But someone had been inside that apartment. Someone had slipped through the sliding glass door, attacked her, stolen her ring, and walked away without leaving a trace. First suspicion fell on David Larkin, the fiancé. It always did. Carter knew the pattern. Lovers, boyfriends, husbands, they were often guilty. The brutal nature of the crime made him the obvious starting point. David arrived from Houston devastated, barely coherent, but Carter pressed him anyway. Why wasn't the door locked? I don't know. She was careful. Maybe she opened it to let in air. When did you last speak to her? Last night, around 7. She said she was making something for me. Carter studied him, looking for cracks, but his alibi checked out. He'd been at a hotel conference dinner, surrounded by colleagues who vouched for him. Phone records backed his story. There was no time, no window, no motive that fit. Still, the whispers started. To neighbors, to classmates, the words formed like smoke. The fiancé did it. He must have. The second layer of suspicion spread to the apartment complex. Rachel had been alone that night, which meant someone nearby, someone who knew her routine, could have been watching. Carter and her team canvassed the units. Residents opened their doors nervously, eyes darting to the notepads, the tape recorders. One name surfaced quickly: Howard Denton. He lived 2 blocks away, a registered sex offender, a man with a reputation for lingering, staring too long, making women uncomfortable. When detectives questioned him, Denton was calm, almost rehearsed. I was home with my wife, he said flatly. Didn't leave the house all night. No cuts, no visible bruises. Just a man in his 30s with a steady stare and an easy lie. Without DNA testing strong enough to tie him to the scene, Carter couldn't press further. Denton slipped back into the shadows of the neighborhood. Back at the crime scene, forensics came up thin. No fingerprints beyond Rachel's and David's. No footprints tracked in from outside. The sliding door frame clean, unforced. The engagement ring missing, but pawn shops turned up nothing. It was a puzzle without pieces. The only haunting clue was the half-finished Valentine's cake on the counter, a mute witness to everything that had unfolded. Rachel's funeral was held a week later in Little Rock, Arkansas. Hundreds attended. Friends from Arlington drove 6 hours to stand beside her family. David Larkin collapsed at the casket, clutching the folded engagement photo he carried everywhere. For her parents, Charles and Evelyn Monroe, grief quickly turned into disbelief. Evelyn's words to reporters echoed across headlines. She was baking a cake for love, and someone came into her home and destroyed her. Whoever did this is still out there. Detective Carter worked the case relentlessly in the weeks that followed. She chased leads, called labs, pressed supervisors for more resources. Each tip unraveled. Each theory collapsed. The apartment complex grew tense. Women double-locked their doors, bought extra chains for their windows. The maintenance worker who found Rachel confessed he couldn't sleep at night, replaying the scene in his head. And in the middle of that paranoia stood Howard Denton, walking freely, nodding to neighbors, smiling thinly when detectives passed. Carter's instincts screamed at her, but without evidence he was untouchable. By March, the case hit its first stall. The trail was cold. Carter filed updates, but the notes carried frustration. No witnesses, no weapon, no physical tie to suspect. Still, one line from her journal captured her unease. It feels like we missed him. He was right in front of us, and we let him go. 9 months later, that unease would explode into violence. Because Howard Denton, the man police had quietly questioned and dismissed, would unleash his rage again. This time, on his wife, on her friend, and finally, on himself, leaving behind not only more blood, but a devastating truth. Rachel Monroe's killer had been in plain sight all along. If you think police should have done more when Denton was first questioned, subscribe now, because the next part of this story shows exactly what happens when warnings are ignored. October 1985, 9 months after the murder of Rachel Monroe. Arlington had begun to move on. The case was still technically open, but it sat buried in the pile of unsolved files that grew thicker by the week. Detective Ellen Carter still thought about it every day, but the department's resources had shifted to fresh cases. And in the quiet neighborhoods just 2 miles from Rachel's apartment, Howard Denton carried on as if nothing had happened. To his neighbors, Denton was a contradiction. He worked odd jobs, fixed cars for cash, claimed he was trying to get steady again, but behind closed doors, his marriage was unraveling. His wife, Linda, had grown distant. Friends confided she told them she no longer trusted him, that he scared her sometimes, even when he hadn't raised a hand. It was his eyes, she said. The way they seemed to darken suddenly without warning. By October, Linda had finally confided in a friend, Margaret Hill, that she was thinking of leaving him. She was scared to be alone in the house. Margaret urged her to come over more often, to keep company until she figured out her next steps. It would prove a fatal gesture of kindness. On the night of October 29, 1985, police were dispatched to a small brick duplex on Magnolia Street after reports of gunshots. When officers forced their way inside, the scene was carnage. Linda Denton lay on the floor near the kitchen, 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. Margaret Hill was slumped against the couch, shot once in the head, and in the bedroom, sprawled across the bed, lay Howard Denton, a revolver clutched in his right hand, a single bullet wound through his skull. The house was silent except for the static of a television left on in the living room. Detective Ellen Carter stood in that living room, staring at the bloodstains, the revolver, the body, and then she saw the face. Howard Denton, the name she had written in her notes 9 months earlier, the neighbor she'd questioned, the man who'd slipped through her grasp. Her chest tightened with fury and dread. It wasn't just that Denton had killed his wife and her friend before turning the gun on himself. It was the thought she couldn't escape. If he had been stopped in February, if they'd found the evidence to tie him to Rachel Monroe's murder, 2 more lives might have been saved. The press called it a domestic tragedy. Neighbors shook their heads, saying Denton was quiet, polite, that they never saw it coming. But Carter saw something else. The closing of a window that had been left open too long. Rachel Monroe's file now sat beside Denton's death report. Carter felt certain he was the link, the rage, the pattern, the proximity. But certainty wasn't evidence. Denton had taken the truth with him when he pulled the trigger. The engagement ring was still missing. The DNA technology wasn't ready. And with the prime suspect dead, the case lost momentum completely. For Rachel's family, the Denton murders only deepened the wound. They say the man who killed my daughter is gone now, but I don't have proof. I don't have a ring. I don't have justice. Her father, Charles, said little. He kept his grief private, pouring it into long nights at his workshop. But friends said he never forgave the system for letting Denton slip by. David Larkin, the fiancé, stopped talking to the press entirely. He carried the weight of whispers that had followed him since the day Rachel was killed. Even as Denton's violence became public, suspicion had left scars. His engagement photo of Rachel remained folded in his wallet, edges frayed from years of opening and closing. For Detective Carter, the Denton murder-suicide was both confirmation and curse. She wrote in her private notes, "I know it was him. Rachel's blood is on his hands too. But without proof, history will forget." And for nearly 4 decades, history did forget. Rachel's case slid into the cold files. Denton's suicide closed off avenues of pursuit, and every Valentine's Day after 1985, Evelyn Monroe lit a candle at her daughter's shrine, whispering a prayer that someday someone would pull the truth from the shadows. But shadows don't stay silent forever, because 39 years later, science would speak where Denton could not. And Rachel Monroe's unfinished cake, her stolen ring, her shattered future, all of it would resurface in a revelation no one saw coming. Subscribe now, because the next chapter reveals how modern science dragged a murderer's name out of the grave and gave Rachel's family the answer they had waited 4 decades to hear. After October 1985, the Monroe case no longer led the news. Denton's murder-suicide had stolen the spotlight, framing him as a violent husband, a man who turned the gun on his own family. The brutality of Rachel's murder faded into the background. Detective Ellen Carter still wrote her reports, still chased leads, but the calls slowed. Witnesses moved away. The trail went cold. By the spring of 1986, Rachel Monroe's file sat in the back of the evidence cabinet, stamped with 2 words: Carter hated. Cold case. For Rachel's parents, time didn't dull anything. Evelyn Monroe lit a candle every Valentine's Day. She placed it beside a framed photo of Rachel smiling in her nursing scrubs, her engagement ring glinting on her finger. Every year, Evelyn said the same thing aloud: "I will not let them forget you." Charles Monroe carried his grief differently. He stopped speaking about Rachel in public. He avoided neighbors who whispered condolences, avoided church gatherings where people wanted to pray for him. Instead, he spent long hours in his workshop, carving wood until his hands blistered. Friends said he spoke to the silence as if Rachel were still listening. David Larkin, the fiancé, bore a different burden. For months after Rachel's death, suspicion had clung to him like smoke. Whispers in bars, questions at work. Even after Denton's violent death, some still muttered, "What if?" David moved out of Arlington 2 years later, relocating to Dallas. He never married. Cow workers recalled that every Valentine's Day he called in sick. He carried the engagement photo of Rachel in his wallet until the leather cracked and frayed. Meanwhile, science crawled forward. By the early 1990s, DNA testing was revolutionizing criminal cases, but the samples from Rachel's murder, blood traces, fibers from her clothing, were too degraded for the early technology. Carter submitted them anyway, hopeful. The results came back inconclusive. Another door closed. In 1998, Carter retired. She left behind a meticulously organized file: interview transcripts, crime scene photos, handwritten notes. On the inside flap, she wrote a single line: "I believe Howard Denton killed Rachel Monroe, but I cannot prove it." Her departure marked the final nail in the coffin. Rachel's case slipped deeper into silence. The 2000s brought new detectives, new cases. Arlington grew. Old apartment complexes were torn down, new ones built in their place. Students at the University of Texas at Arlington barely recognized Rachel's name. But in Little Rock, Evelyn Monroe kept the shrine alive. She refused to move Rachel's belongings from her childhood room. The textbooks, the Polaroids, the sweater folded on the chair. Each year, she sent a letter to Arlington PD, begging for updates. Most went unanswered. The most painful reminders came in fragments. A local newspaper in 2005 ran a Valentine's Day Unsolved article. Rachel's name appeared for 2 paragraphs. The photo printed was grainy, cropped. Evelyn clipped it anyway and tucked it into her Bible. In 2010, a true crime radio show mentioned Rachel's case briefly, framing it as likely solved because of Denton's death. Evelyn called in, furious. It was not solved. We never had proof. The host thanked her politely, then moved on. By 2015, 30 years had passed. Rachel would have been 52. Instead, her mother stood alone at the cemetery, placing flowers on an empty grave. But the evidence never disappeared. The slides, the fibers, the swabs, all carefully preserved in the Arlington PD evidence room, labeled sealed, waiting for science that didn't yet exist. Detectives who rotated through the unit sometimes pulled Rachel's file. They saw the photos of the unfinished cake, the sliding glass door, the bruises. They read the notes, naming Denton, and each time the same frustration: too late. He was dead. He had taken the truth with him. Or so they thought. By 2020, the field of investigative genetic genealogy was transforming cold cases nationwide. DNA that once meant nothing could now be compared to genealogy databases, building family trees that pointed to suspects even decades later. Rachel's case file was pulled one more time. Samples were resubmitted. Analysts worked carefully, teasing out fragments of DNA left behind on her clothing. This time, the results didn't collapse. This time, the science was ready. In August 2024, 39 years after Valentine's Day, 39 years after the half-finished cake was left on the counter, the call came. The DNA belonged to Howard Denton, the man who had been questioned in 1985, the man who killed his wife and her friend before turning the gun on himself, the man Detective Carter had always suspected. After decades of silence, the evidence finally spoke. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter you'll see how investigators pulled Howard Denton's ghost out of the grave and what Rachel's family felt when the truth they had waited 39 years for finally arrived. August 2024, 39 years after Valentine's Day, The box that held Rachel Monroe's evidence was dusty, the label yellowed, the tape brittle. Inside were artifacts that had survived decades of silence: swabs, fibers, slides, sealed envelopes, things the original investigators had preserved, but could not use. For years, those items had meant nothing, but now they held the power to speak. The Arlington Police Cold Case Unit had partnered with the FBI to run the samples through a new process: investigative genetic genealogy. It wasn't just about comparing a DNA strand to a criminal database. It was about finding distant relatives, cousins, uncles, grandparents, and building a family tree backwards until it pointed to one name. It was meticulous work. Analysts sat at glowing monitors, pulling together fragments of DNA, uploading them to genealogical databases, comparing them against millions of voluntary entries. At first, the matches were faint. A third cousin here, a distant relative there, threads scattered across states. But slowly, a tree emerged. At its root was a name the investigators already knew: Howard Denton. The confirmation hit like a thunderclap. The partial DNA profile recovered from Rachel's clothing in 1985 now matched Denton's family line. The probability of error was infinitesimal. Science had done what the 1980s never could. Detectives leaned back in their chairs, staring at the printout. It wasn't just a match, it was closure. The man they had questioned, the man who had smiled calmly when asked about Valentine's night, the man who, 9 months later, killed his wife and her friend before pulling the trigger on himself. It was him. Detective Ellen Carter had long since retired. She was in her 80s now, living quietly outside Fort Worth. But when she received the call, her voice cracked. "I knew it," she whispered. "I wrote it in the file. I knew it was him." For nearly 4 decades, that note in the margin had been nothing more than suspicion. Now, it was vindication. The announcement came on August 14, 2024. Arlington police held a press conference. Cameras clicked. Reporters scribbled. Chief investigators stood at the podium and spoke the words Evelyn Monroe had waited 39 years to hear. The DNA evidence confirms that Rachel Monroe was murdered by Howard Denton, who was a registered sex offender living nearby at the time of her death. Denton later committed a murder-suicide in 1985, ending his life before facing justice. This case is now officially solved. Evelyn Monroe sat in the front row, clutching a photograph of Rachel. Tears streaked her face as she listened. "It should have been solved long ago," she said softly. "But at least now we know. At least now I can say her name and not wonder who did it." Charles Monroe, frail and stooped, said little. He nodded once, eyes fixed on the podium, his hand resting on his wife's. For David Larkin, the news landed like a stone in water. For 39 years he had lived under suspicion. He had been questioned, doubted, whispered about. Even after Denton's violent death, there were always people who wondered if David had played a role. Now, at last, he was free of that shadow. "It wasn't me," he told a local reporter, voice shaking. "I loved her, and I've been waiting half my life for someone to believe that." He pulled the old photo from his wallet, the one of Rachel in front of the Christmas tree smiling with the engagement ring on her finger. The edges were frayed, but the face was as clear as ever. The evidence had done what human memory could not. It had reached through decades, through Denton's death, through silence, and pulled his name into the light. But the resolution was bittersweet. Rachel's engagement ring had never been found. Denton had taken it, pawned it, or hidden it forever. The ring remained missing, a symbol of the future Rachel never got to live. And Denton himself was beyond punishment, dead since 1985, buried in an unmarked grave. There would be no trial, no confession, no cross-examination, only certainty. Still, certainty mattered. For Evelyn Monroe, it meant she could finally stop sending letters every Valentine's Day. For Charles, it meant he could finally close Rachel's childhood bedroom door. For David, it meant he could breathe without the weight of suspicion. And for the city of Arlington, it meant a story that had haunted them since 1985 finally had an ending, even if it came too late. On the kitchen counter of the Monroe home in Little Rock, the shrine remained. A framed photo of Rachel in her scrubs, a candle that Evelyn lit every February 14th. And beside it, a clipping of the 2024 headline, "DNA solves 39-year-old Valentine's Day murder. Killer identified as neighbor." Subscribe now, because the final chapters of this story show not just the science that solved it, but the haunting legacy Rachel Monroe left behind. The unfinished cake, the stolen ring, and the reminder that sometimes justice arrives too late. The announcement in August 2024 should have felt like triumph. After all, the case was solved. The killer had a name. His crimes were confirmed by science, not just suspicion. But inside the Monroe family home in Little Rock, the mood was quieter, bittersweet. Evelyn Monroe sat at her kitchen table, the candle flickering beside Rachel's photograph. She repeated the words the police had given her. "Howard Denton killed your daughter. The DNA proves it." She shook her head slowly. "I always knew it was him," she whispered. "But it doesn't bring her back. It doesn't bring my baby back." For Charles Monroe, the confirmation landed like a stone. He had carried his grief silently for decades, pouring it into work and avoiding the public spotlight. Now, with Denton's name confirmed, he finally spoke. "They let him slip away in '85. If they had done more then, maybe my daughter wouldn't have been forgotten for 40 years. Maybe Evelyn wouldn't have had to carry this alone." His words weren't bitter, they were tired. The voice of a man who had carried too much for too long. Rachel's fiancé, David Larkin, faced the news with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief, because at last, he was free of suspicion. The whispers that had followed him for decades could finally stop. The headline cleared him without needing to say his name. DNA identifies neighbor as killer. But sorrow, because closure was hollow when there was no one left to punish. In an interview with a local station, David's voice cracked as he held up the Polaroid of him and Rachel from Christmas night. "She was baking me a Valentine's cake. That's the last thing she did. How do you carry that for 39 years? How do you ever move on from that?" For Arlington, the revelation was jarring. Neighbors remembered Denton as the man police had questioned and released. Some admitted they'd always suspected him. Others said they never saw the signs. The more shocking truth was the timing. 9 months after Rachel's murder, Denton had killed again, murdering his wife and her friend before turning the gun on himself. The press seized on the story. Headlines blared. "Cold case solved. Killer already dead. Since DNA names neighbor in Valentine's Day murder." The community asked the same painful question. Could Rachel's death and the 2 murders that followed, have been prevented if police had acted sooner. Detective Ellen Carter, now retired, answered honestly. "We didn't have the tools back then, but my gut told me it was him. I wrote it in the file, and now the science finally says I was right." The crime scene details resurfaced in the coverage, each one more haunting than the last. The sliding glass door left unlocked, the engagement ring stolen, never found, the heart-shaped cake abandoned mid-preparation, a symbol frozen in time. For many, that cake became the defining image of the case. Valentine's Day, love and promise, interrupted by violence and death. The tragedy also sparked a renewed conversation about cold cases in Texas. Reporters pressed Arlington PD. How many other files sat gathering dust in the evidence room? How many suspects had slipped away, only to commit more violence? How many families were still waiting for answers that DNA might already hold? The department promised to review older cases using IgG. But for the Monroe family, the promise rang hollow. They had waited nearly 4 decades. They had buried their daughter. No new promise could erase that. At Rachel's memorial in September 2024, friends and family gathered once more. Evelyn lit her candle, the same way she had every year since 1985. But this time she added a clipping of the headline to the shrine. She spoke softly to her daughter's photograph. "They know now, sweetheart. They know who took you, and they know you didn't deserve what happened. But I wish you had lived long enough to see justice yourself." Her voice broke. "I'm sorry it came too late." For David, the hardest part was the unfinished story. The engagement ring Denton had stolen was never recovered. Somewhere out there it still existed, pawned, melted down, or hidden away. That ring, to David, symbolized more than just theft. It symbolized the life Rachel never got to live. "She should have worn it down the aisle," he said quietly. Instead, he ripped it off her finger, and that's what the world remembers. By fall, the Monroe case file was officially stamped, solved. But solved did not mean healed. Solved did not mean closure. Solved meant only that the silence had a name. And in that name, Howard Denton, lay the bitter truth. Justice had arrived, but justice had arrived too late. Rachel Monroe's story didn't end in a courtroom. It ended in a press conference nearly 40 years too late, with a name pulled from a grave and a family left to wrestle with what justice really meant. The case was solved, the killer identified. But closure? That was harder to find. Detectives revisiting the file noticed the same details again and again, almost as if the crime scene had been whispering its truth all along. The sliding glass door left unlocked. A simple decision, one Rachel may not have thought twice about, but one that gave her killer the opening he needed. To her family, that door became a symbol of vulnerability, of how quickly safety can shatter. The engagement ring, stolen from her finger, worth $5,000 in 1985, but priceless to David Larkin, who had saved every paycheck to buy it. Denton ripped it away not just as loot, but as a cruel gesture, stripping Rachel of the symbol of her future. That ring was never recovered. Its absence hangs over the story like an unfinished sentence. And the heart-shaped cake, left unfinished on the counter, batter half stirred, oven cold, it became the image reporters used, the detail true crime readers never forgot. A celebration of love, interrupted mid-motion by violence. 3 objects, 3 reminders that Rachel's life was interrupted, not erased. In Little Rock, Evelyn Monroe still keeps the shrine alive. A photo of Rachel in her scrubs. The clipping of the 2024 headline. The candle she lights every Valentine's Day. And beside it, a small recipe card. Rachel's handwriting in blue ink. Valentine's cake for David. Evelyn says she reads it every February, as if by doing so she can hold on to the daughter she lost. For David Larkin, the legacy is quieter. He never remarried. He never stopped carrying Rachel's photo. When asked what the DNA revelation meant to him, he said, "It means I can breathe again." People know I didn't hurt her, but it also means I've been carrying her ghost for 40 years. I don't know how to put her down now." He pauses, looking at the worn Polaroid. "She's frozen in time for me. 22 forever, baking me a cake she never got to finish." Detective Ellen Carter, the woman who suspected Denton from the start, now lives in a small house outside Fort Worth. Her files are boxed away, but Rachel's case sits on top. She keeps the photo of the crime scene tucked inside the front flap. "I think about her every February," she admits. "I think about how close we were. We had him in our hands, and he slipped away. That's the part I can't forgive myself for." When asked what the DNA match meant to her, Carter gave the simplest answer: "It told me my instincts weren't wrong, but it came 40 years too late." The community, too, still feels the shadow. Older residents remember the fear of 1985, the way women double-locked their doors, the way suspicion poisoned friendships. Younger ones know the story as a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil can live just across the street. Even now, people driving past the old apartment complex whisper. They know what happened inside. They know Rachel's life ended there in a kitchen with a half-mixed bowl of cake batter. Rachel's legacy is not just her death, but the silence that followed it. For 39 years, her family carried unanswered questions. For 39 years, her fiancé carried suspicion. For 39 years, the truth sat in an evidence box, waiting for science to catch up. And when the truth finally came, it felt less like victory and more like an epitaph. The last words belonged to Rachel Monroe. Standing at her daughter's grave on Valentine's Day 2025, candle in hand, she whispered into the cold wind, "They say you have justice now, Rachel, but justice isn't supposed to take 40 years. Justice isn't supposed to come after he's already gone. All I know is you were loved. All I know is you are still loved." She placed the candle at the base of the headstone, beside a heart-shaped wreath of roses. The flame flickered in the dark, fragile but unbroken. And then she said the words she had spoken every year since "I will not let them forget you." Subscribe now, because stories like Rachel Monroe's deserve to be remembered, not buried. And because for every case solved, there are still families waiting in the dark for answers.